This is episode 38 of the Women in Depth podcast. The information found in this podcast is not a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional. Hi, and welcome back to the podcast. I'm very excited about today's episode. I had the privilege of speaking with Susie Arnett about a topic that truly goes beneath the surface and takes a closer look at the experiences of men. There are insights and perspectives in today's conversation that will definitely get you thinking. It might make some uncomfortable and may even be controversial for other listeners. For some listeners, it will expand their understanding of men, and that is what we are hoping for. Susie Arnett will guide us through her experiences in creating the Testosterone Project. She'll talk about why she undertook this research, what she discovered, and why it matters. Today, my guest is Susie Arnett. Susie is a writer, producer, and creativity coach based in Western Massachusetts. She spent 15 years as a producer and development executive working for networks like Lifetime, Warner Brothers, HBO, and Fox. She has also written for multiple blogs as well as national magazines like More Magazine. Currently, Susie works with many of the world's top experts and teachers at the Kripalu Center, developing retreats, trainings, and digital experiences, and also runs a boutique consulting business where she supports thought leaders and businesses in developing original ideas that make the world a better place. Hi, Susie, and welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Yes, I'm very excited that we are having this conversation. I think that our topic is one that will resonate with everyone because everyone has at least one man in their life that they love and care about. Mm-hmm. or a man to be. So very excited to learn more about your research and your work. But for now, to just start off, could you share a little bit more about yourself with our listeners?
Sure. It's funny, as I was preparing to speak to you, it made me look back, at my life and the work that I've done. And I think it's really been defined by ideas and by ideas that have captured my attention. And almost by accident, I ended up in the television business out of college. And it really was a great training ground for working with ideas. And, there's always, as a producer, there's always this balance of what's just my idea and what's an idea that your audience will be interested in. And so, the 15 years that I spent in TV was really an exploration of, I think this is really interesting, but will anyone else think this is really interesting? And, I worked for a lot of networks where we were able to really experiment and try out ideas. And so I think that curiosity and that exploration is what brought me to create the Testosterone Project.
I love how you shared that this accidental experience of finding yourself in the television industry really was a place where you could test ideas and also, even just think about, does anyone else care about this idea? Because I know for me, there was a time when I thought, oh, this is a great idea because I thought it was a great idea, not necessarily looking at it from the perspective of others.
Yeah, well, and I do think that ideas that are really passionate that an individual is really passionate about always has its audience, because we're human and we have so much in common that something that's deeply personal and relevant to one person will resonate with others. But, I feel like I came into TV at a really interesting time when cable was just starting, which is now I'm dating myself. But, when I started in TV, there were only 4 networks. Remember those days?
I don't know. Oh, wow.
It was the 3 networks and Fox.
I remember those days.
And so, when so MTV was just starting and all the cable networks and, there really was an opportunity to try stuff out. And it was interesting because we really didn't know what would work. I mean, and maybe on some level you never really know for sure, but those early days in cable really were a testing ground for a lot of things, for different audiences and for different ideas. And as we know now, just from what's happened in television, especially nonfiction, over the last 15 years, it's been pretty crazy where it's gone with reality TV and everything.
So I don't think this is off topic, but what would you say are the gifts or the lessons at this time in the early days of these networks, and what were the gifts in that for you?
Well, I think there are a few different gifts. One of the things as a woman working in the television business, now we're talking, the late 80s, early 90s, right? This is a long time ago. But if I had actually, when I was starting out, I sent my resume to all 4 networks. And, let me just take a step back. When I graduated from college, I was going to be an artist. And so the only job that I could get as an artist was as a graphic designer. And so I did that for about a year and realized it wasn't really meaningful to me the way making art was. And so I thought, well, if I have to work, what am I going to do? So I sent my resume to the 4 networks because I really had this passion for sharing information with people. That's always been important to me. I like learning things and I like sharing what I've learned. And so I felt like if I can get into a newsroom, then I would be able to do that as a job and I could paint on the side. And it just happened that I got a call back from Fox. And I ended up getting a job in an internship program there where I was able to travel through every department. The idea was that you would be an intern and you'd make no money, but you'd get to work in every department and see what part of the company that you liked. And it just so happened that within a month or something of being there, a position opened up in the newsroom and I interviewed for it and I got it. So I was able to move through that process fairly quickly. And within a few years, I had gotten a job as a segment producer at MTV. And I know if I had gotten a job right away at one of the 3 networks at ABC, NBC, or CBS, it would have taken me 10 years, 20 years to get to that level. But because cable was in its early days and was a little bit like the Wild West in some ways, that somebody like me who was able to do what I was able, was able to work hard and have ideas and commit to it, I was able to move very quickly up the ladder. And within 5 or 6 years, I had gotten a job as a vice president at Lifetime in their programming department. That would never have happened at a network.
Yeah.
It would have taken decades. And so there was a lot of mobility, especially for women, because the networks at that time was really run by men.
Yeah.
And as a young woman coming in, there was a lot of that kind of gender dynamic going on. I haven't worked in the TV business a long time. I'm assuming things have changed in a lot of ways. But cable really opened up opportunity for women right from the start because they needed the people. They were hiring and they had so much work and we were filling hours and hours and hours of new airspace, that hadn't existed before. And so, there was really great opportunity back then.
Yeah, it sounds like a very exciting time in many different ways and areas, exciting for television, exciting for women, exciting for, what was to be created and inspiring too, because this had never been done before. So you were really kind of blazing a trail and there was like no one saying this is the way to do it, right? Because it had never been done before.
No, it's so true. And it's funny, I was at MTV when they started. I worked in news at MTV. We did shows like The Week in Rock and House of Style, documentaries, things like that. But at the time, there was another department at MTV that had created Real World. And the only reason they had created Real World was because they couldn't afford to do a real soap opera with actors and writers. It was too expensive for it. They didn't have the budget. And so that show really that was like a resource. That was like what do they call that expression? Like mother is the invention. Oh, necessity is the mother of invention.
Necessity is the mother of all invention, I think.
That's right. And that's Real World. And Real World really, as we all know, just started a genre in the most amazing way. Sometimes when you don't have the money and all the access that you want, you're able to really do something different and interesting. And they did,
That's amazing.
Change the world. Yeah.
What a great, just metaphor of, that You don't need all the slick, glossy pictures and the great music and all the marketing. If sometimes simple is actually going to force you to get really creative and come up with something really meaningful. And yeah, that's a great story.
Yeah, and you're right. And I think we see this every day, even what you're doing. That now the technology is such where anybody who has an idea can create something and can put something out into the world. And that was unheard of 15 years ago.
Yeah.
So it's an amazing time for artists and writers and creators and people with a voice.
So Susie, can you share your journey into creating the Testosterone Project? How did this idea begin? And, if you can just tell that story, that would be great.
Well, it was interesting because I was home. I was a mom for many years. When I had my kids, I retired from the television business and was home and was grateful to be able to be home with them. And that was really my primary focus of creativity for many years. And one of the things that I started to notice in a lot of the people that I had become friends with, when you have kids, you kind of get into this whole mom community,
Right.
And what it seemed, and this was in Los Angeles where we were living at the time, and what I noticed that there just seemed to be this real trend of couples and families where the woman was doing was really supporting her family or supporting the relationship and supporting the man. And I just thought it was really interesting. And it seemed to be as if, the men were working hard, they were good guys, they were trying, but that they weren't actually able to deliver in like a real concrete way. And so I just started talking to my friends about this, and it seemed like everybody had a story or knew somebody. And I started doing some research because I just thought it was so interesting. And, I have a son, and it made me wonder about what was going on in our culture with men. And there were amazing books out there. Hannah Rosen from The Atlantic had written a book called The End of Men. And there was all this writing going on, which, was a real source of information for me. And as I was online and reading and digging into this subject, I found this study that had been done in the Boston area. And it was one of the longest studies, longitudinal studies of testosterone levels of American men. And it was something that was where they tracked men over, I think, 20 years, all ages. And what they found was that overall, testosterone levels had dropped almost by a third.
Wow.
This is young men, old men. It wasn't something like you got older and they dropped, but even 20-year-old men had less testosterone than 20-year-old men did 20 years ago. And so that I thought was so interesting because a lot of what I was reading about men and around testosterone talked about the relationship between testosterone and things like earning power and testosterone and assertiveness. So it made me start to question maybe what was going on with these men wasn't psychological. Like, it's easy to make that a psychological story, right? He doesn't want to work, or he's this, or there's some irresponsibility maybe. It's easy to turn it into that kind of story. But when I saw this research, it really made me step back and say, you know what? There's like a biochemical aspect to this as well. And when you look at something like the ridiculous levels of depression in men and suicide in men, that's not just psychological. There's something else going on as well. There's something in the body. There's something in the brain. There's something in what we're eating and in our environment. And there's something in the loss of social status in a lot of, in parts of this country that's also affecting this level. And, it's when they drop, it impacts mood, depression, anxiety, just across the board. It's really a problem. So I just felt like it was an important thing to share. I felt like I had discovered something really interesting that nobody in my circle had known about, and they were all so interested in it. And it felt like something that was really important to share. So I thought, okay, I'm going to do this online.
So, Susie, when you said you noticed that these men were good men, but they weren't able to deliver in a concrete way, can you give some examples of what you meant by that?
Sure. I mean, really, I think in the most basic way, they just weren't contributing financially to their families.
Okay.
There were a lot of couples that I knew where the man he hadn't worked in a year and a half.
Yeah.
Or he wasn't able to make any money, or he was earning at a fraction of what he had been earning. And so there's so many levels to this. There's economic levels and there's cultural levels. And, I don't want to make it about one thing, but the reason I did the Testosterone Project is because I felt like nobody was talking about the body in this story, and how much that's impacting. And, I remember I worked with a woman years ago named Sue Othmer, who is an amazing neurofeedback clinician. And she talked about the brain and how, it's like you're riding a bike on the boardwalk, on the sidewalk, and then all of a sudden you get in the sand. And it's like you're 2 inches from the sidewalk, but you're in the sand and you're just struggling to move forward. But if you could just get on the sidewalk, it would be so much easier. And I think with our hormones and our biochemistry is off, it's like being in the sand,
Yeah.
And the struggle is so real, even though you're so close to your capacity.
Yeah.
And what you can contribute.
You made me think of something that one of my mentors has written about. He's actually going to be on the podcast in the next few weeks or so. And he spoke about how one of the challenges of being a man is that, for example, as women, we know that we struggle with things like body issues and, if you're being a good enough mom, just the typical things that women find that we share in common as far as struggles. And that for men, it was very difficult because for them, their status, the determination of their worth was largely determined by their earning power and their physical strength. And that this puts an undue burden on men because there's, he said, if you flipped it around and women have their own struggles, but if a woman was, her worth was determined by how much money she made instead of how sexy she is or what a perfect body she has, that, just that comes with its own set of challenges, So I thought that was really interesting.
That is interesting. And it's true. I think men and women both have real challenges.
Yes.
And, I think the thing that I really got from this and that's primary is that we can't compare our challenges.
Yeah.
Because women feel like, oh, our situation is so much worse, or men feel like, oh, our situation is so much worse. I mean, like everybody is the equal opportunity suffering.
Yes.
And I mean, I don't want to dismiss, thousands of years of female oppression, but at the same time, when you look at modern time, I think everybody has something that they're working against.
Yes.
But it's true with men. There's Warren Farrell is a very interesting thinker and writer about this. And he talks about, he was part of, the now National Organization of Women back in the heyday of the women's movement in New York City, I believe. And he put out a book, which I think they pushed him off the board and he was completely vilified by the feminist movement. And one of the things he said in that book was why he's trying to bring equality to relationships. It's one of the things I think that's important to Warren. And he talks about what's wrong with a woman supporting a man. Everybody thinks it's okay for a man to support a woman. Why is it so bad for a woman to support a man? Why does that seem so wrong to so many people, right?
Yeah.
Why is a woman unwilling to support a man? And it's interesting because I talked to him a while back and I've supported a man. I know what that's like. And even for me, who is educated, feminist, professional, mom, all these things, even I struggle with that because I have no problem with the idea of a man supporting me. But the idea of me supporting a man did not come easily.
Right. Yeah.
And so there's a lot of really deeply ingrained ideas that even women who've grown up in the women's movement, which I haven't, I'm 51. I grew up, my mom was one of the first generation of women in the computer industry and really a role model for me for a working woman, back when a lot of my friends' moms didn't work. And even in that environment, I still carry so many assumptions about how things should be.
Yeah.
We're all working it through our conditioning, I think,
Yes. And, you cannot work through it unless you become aware of it. And you're right that a lot of these they've just been there for generations. It's a collective, something collective that we all carry that we don't even know is a lens that we're looking at the world through.
So true. So true.
So, Susie, can you share what exactly the Testosterone Project is about, what it entails?
Sure. The Testosterone Project is the web series where I interview different experts about men because I really wanted to understand what was going on for men now, in this culture, in this time. And so I started with a doctor, and I found a great urologist in Manhattan named Dr. Harry Fish. And we had this great conversation really about testosterone and how it operates in the man's body and brain and personality. And I tried to look at all the different sides of the story. So I talked to a doctor, I talked to a movement specialist Cass Phelps in Hawaii, who just had the most interesting insights about how, men came into this world with these big muscles. They were designed to pick up heavy things, to build, to create at that level. And now so many men are sitting at desks on a computer all day and don't get to use what their bodies are made for and what happens as a result of that. And my aim in doing it was to really try and understand more, I think, what men are going through and what they're going through today, with the culture that we're in, with the environment that we're in. I talked to an environmental scientist who talked about how we're really swimming in a sea of estrogen. When you look at all the plastics and all the estrogen mimicking chemicals that are in our food and in our environment, and how it's almost emasculating men on some level. And, I think our bodies are being kind of confronted and attacked on so many levels that we don't even know. I mean, we really are evolving in some ways as a species through all the chemicals in the environment that we live in and the way our diets changed over the last 100 years. So, it's a very fluid situation, right now.
And what parts of this project were the most significant for you? Like what, out of all these interviews, what stood out the most?
The thing that stood out the most to me, and it was kind of a surprise because I really kind of went into this wanting to get some information. I wanted to find some answers.
Right.
And I ended up getting something very different, which is that it made me so compassionate to men, for men, which I'm sorry to say I wasn't as compassionate maybe before I started it. But, over the course of working on this project, I interviewed a lot of men as well. I didn't just talk to experts. I was constantly in the grocery store or when I was out or wherever I was, I would ask men questions. I would talk to them. I became very curious, about their experience. And it was amazing how when I approached men in a curious way, not wanting something from them or not defending myself against them, but really just wanting to understand them, how beautifully they opened up to me and shared with me at a level that I don't think I'd ever seen before in my life, through all my years of dating and relationship and work and friendship,
Yeah.
And so what I ended up really getting, what was most meaningful about it was that it really kind of opened my heart in some way and made me see how much they are struggling as much as women are, as much as we are. And nobody has an easy ride through this human life. And I appreciated that lesson so much. I didn't know that's why I went into this, but it really was a gift for me.
So really being able to open your heart to the experiences of men and their own struggles was one of the things that surprised you and was also a gift in all of this.
Yeah. When I first started working on this, I was working at the Omega Institute, which is a retreat center in the Hudson Valley. And every year they have a program and a panel called something like How to Be Romantic. And they had 4 women, and I was one of those 4 women on this panel. And there were maybe 20 men that were on campus that week who came in to ask us questions because they wanted to know about their wives or their girlfriends, and they had all these different questions. And for about an hour and a half, the 4 of us women fielded these questions from all these men in all different kinds of relationships. And we all left that panel just amazed at almost how scared men were of the women in their lives. And I know this isn't true for everybody. And I know there's a lot of, there's hostility and there's violence and there's a lot of things in the world, but there's also this really incredible community of men who really want to do the right thing and don't know what that is. And because of the way maybe relationships have evolved or their lives have evolved, they're scared and they're unsure and they don't know, they don't have any answers either. And, one of the things that I was talking to somebody about this the other day, it's easy and valid to talk about women and glass ceilings, right?
Right.
We all know what that's about, and many of us have experienced that. There's just as many men who've experienced glass ceilings as women, and maybe more. And maybe yes, I've worked in a lot of companies with a lot of women where there was always a man at the top, but there were as many men as women who didn't get that job also.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to remember that. And just like more men, there was a statistic that I found about how men hurt men more than men hurt women, right? When you look at murder and rates of violence around the country, men are killing men at a greater rate than they're killing women. And so I don't want to underplay, gender discrimination or violence at all. But at the same time, we got to remember that there's whole populations of men who also are discriminated against and victims of violence. And, I think it's important not to lump everybody into one category, just like we don't want as women to be put into one category.
So really, what I'm hearing is that this project, for you kind of like opened you up to a whole new way of looking at men and the way that they are moving through the world, so that there's just a lot more, I guess, room for acceptance and compassion. And, I think too that this is an interesting place to be at, especially being a feminist,
Mm-hmm,
right?
mm-hmm.
And kind of being able to hold this position of, yes, this is what has happened for women is happening for women, but this is also what's happening for men. And really, you're acknowledging both sides of this polarity instead of this men versus women or, women have been so mistreated. It's really making space for everyone and everyone's experiences and allowing them all to be equally valid, equally important.
I hope so. And I think if the Testosterone Project can open anyone's mind or heart to a man in their life or to a person in their life, then that would make me really happy, because it really did open my eyes and my heart. And so I think that's part of my intention with it, is that it can help us be more compassionate and understanding towards each other. I don't want to get too political about this, but I'm so grateful for the women's movement and all the incredible changes and work, and I have absolutely benefited from it. But I think there is this category of men that really was hurt by it. And I don't know, category may not be the right word, but there was a whole population of men who actually are good guys, who felt like, I don't know, I talked to a lot of men who just like good guys, who really felt almost bad about being men.
Right. Like they were lumped into this definition of men, and it's women versus men, or women versus those who have held us down or repressed us, or, that type of thing.
Exactly. And the ones who needed to change, the ones who were oppressing, they don't care, right? They don't care about the women's movement because they don't care anyway. But the men who do care really took that in. And I feel like we're, in some ways, in some cases, hurt by it.
Yeah.
And so I think for me, especially as a mother of a boy, part of what's important to me as a woman is, okay, how do we empower good men? How do we empower men to be good? This kind of thing is just as important to me as my own empowerment, my daughter's empowerment. We all need to be at our best,
Yes.
especially the world that we're in right now. And so I don't know what the answer to that is, but I think it's really important to think about how can we all be at our best? And it's not black and white at all. It's very complicated right now, obviously.
I wanted to go back to something else you said earlier about the men on men violence.
Mm.
And another thing that my mentor, Dr. James Hollis, had mentioned, he has this quote that men are violent because they've been violated by other men, and he also, I'm not saying this as articulately as him by far, but basically that, if you want to imagine what it feels like to be a man, he said, take away all of your supports, all the women who you talk to when you're having a bad day. Take away the ability to show that you are struggling, that you're sad, that you're overwhelmed, that you're having, that maybe you're afraid. And then also make the measure by which you are evaluated be based on your physical strength, your size, and the amount of money that you bring into the world. And he goes, and that's what it feels like to be a man in general.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you can hear how painful that is and how much suffering comes out of that, as it is for women who are really struggling with the pressures and expectations.
Yeah. So you spoke about a series of interviews that you did in the Testosterone Project. Can you share what some of the topics were so that our listeners can get a sense of what was involved and the discussions that you had?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, Dr. Harry Fish is the urologist who talked a lot about just how testosterone works in the body, and how it impacts mood, what makes the levels drop. One of the things that I thought was interesting is how much sugar and carbs are a problem. And I mean, it seems so kind of maybe superficial or silly to talk about diet when we're talking about all these big ideas, but a really high carb, high sugar diet is a huge problem for men. And, they talk about man boobs because the estrogen levels are too high. This is not just you don't look good in your genes issue. There's a lot of psychological, cognitive, mood issues that are related to that.
And, it makes sense, though, that you look at something as basic as diet, because that is a huge piece of the mental health experience. And even as a therapist, that's so important, what people are putting into their bodies. So, no, it's not something small at all.
Yeah, no, it was amazing. I mean, for all of us, it's true. We have to be careful about what we're eating and what we're consuming. And so that was where I started, with the series with the body. Let's really look at the body and how because another person that I interviewed is a woman named Carol Kwiatkowski, and she is a researcher, PhD in Colorado, executive director of the Endocrine Disruption Exchange. And they've been studying endocrine disruption, which is, chemicals that impact hormone levels, estrogen levels, testosterone levels, and how the impact is greater on men and boys than it is on females.
Wow.
And, this idea of the sea of estrogen that we're living in is also part of what's really impacting testosterone levels, which have this cascade effect of affecting drive, motivation, earning power, all the things that testosterone is correlated with.
And so for listeners who are wanting to take this information and create a different relationship or experience with the men in their lives, what would your suggestion be for them?
Well, first thing I would say is they should go to the Testosterone Project and watch it and see. And I do want to make a plug for goodmenproject.com. which made a home for us on their
Yeah.
website and is really a wonderful, amazing platform where men and women are talking about men and what's happening in, kind of the current culture. And it was interesting to learn that I think half the readers of almost on Good Men Project are women. And so I think, we're interested in the men in our lives and want to understand them more and want to, love them more and get along better with them and all those things. I think really the most important thing that I would say is that it's so important to just kind of cut each other some slack. That when there are issues or when there are problems in personal relationships, especially, it's easy to point your finger at this or that, but there's so many more levels underneath that might be causing the behavior or the response or the whatever,
Mm-hmm.
And so I hope that it can help us all, me included, look more deeply at each other and what's actually going on. I talked to a wonderful poet named Carlos Andres Gomez, who talked a lot about can a man be sensitive and strong? And he grew up in a very macho Latino culture and is also this incredibly beautiful, tender-hearted poet, and spoken word artist. And so kind of like you were talking earlier about your mentor and how he described the challenges of men, Carlos did as well. And about how do you be a really tender-hearted, sensitive man in the culture,
Right.
And I think that conversation hopefully will help us have more compassion to just, we think we're balancing all these roles, and we are mothers and workers and partners and whatever else we're doing, and men have just as many roles that they're juggling.
So I think, what came to mind when you were talking right now was also it's about giving men permission to be other than what society says they should be and the expectations are. And by giving them that space and that container to show all parts of them, that allows them to also feel accepted just as they are and not have to put forth this facade of what a man should be. Permission to be afraid, permission to be sensitive, permission to not know what to do, permission to lean on the woman and have her be strong. I think that, if I take anything away from our conversation, it's just that I think that our society, we as a woman, I know myself included, we've also stereotyped men and tried to force them into a cookie cutter mold of this is what a man should be. And recognizing that we do that, and just allowing for them to be who they are and being compassionate and curious about their journey, about their experience.
I think that's so true, and there's so many amazing people out there doing a lot of wonderful work around women's empowerment. And it's such an important space. And it's kind of funny to say that there's also this need for men's empowerment on some level. And because men have been in power, for millennia. But I think for a lot of men, the work of empowerment is essential right now. And empowerment, like you say, to be able to speak their truth. And even if that means they're scared or they don't know or whatever it might look like, that's not appropriate in this moment, feels not appropriate. And so I think that empowerment training or work is important for so many of us right now, as we continue to build the future, that we want for our kids. I guess it just kind of comes down to we're all in this together.
Yeah.
Even though it doesn't look like it or feel like it all the time.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So as you have, as you're able to look back on this work that you've done with the Testosterone Project, were there any myths or taboos or, I guess, misperceptions that you felt that these interviews brought to the surface?
That's a good question. Something that comes to mind is around this area of sensitivity and strength, about that polarity. And I think as women, we've always walked that line. We've always had to find our place on that continuum between sensitivity and strength. We've, for decades and longer, we've had to maybe keep our mouths shut when we wanted to speak, or we've had to hide when we wanted to come out in some way. And I believe that men also are on that same journey, on that same continuum between sensitivity and strength, and in a way that was really eye-opening for me, because there is a perception that, well, men are stronger than we are. They have had more power for longer than we have. They are the CEOs, and the statistics still show that, of course, the majority of people in charge of the big companies are men, right? But that they are very much on a journey on that same continuum of sensitivity and strength, and finding their true place on there.
Yeah.
And maybe now this is gonna maybe sound sexist on some level, but I think because women have been in this conversation long, we've had the decades of this movement and of dialogue around this, and of relationships that support this conversation. And like you said, men don't. They tend to really get isolated. They don't have the practice that we do, that I think we have a responsibility to help them have this conversation. And it's funny, when I first put the Testosterone Project on Good Men Project, I think when the first post launched, we got a very, that people can comment on your posts.
Yeah.
And the first comment was a man who was furious at me. He said, "How dare you as a woman do this? You have no idea what you're talking about. You don't know who I am." I mean, really angry and rageful that a woman would do this. And so I think that that's part of what's out there as well. And it really made me think, it's really important that we're all in this conversation. We're not separated and siloed and distinct from each other. We are in this world together and in relationship together, and women have different strengths. And maybe one of them is that we have had more practice in this conversation. And so if we can be a safe place for men to open up about this, I think that's a really great service that we can offer the world in some way.
What stood out for me right now when you shared that is just how, if I take anything away from our conversation today, what it would be is just really, this is the beginning of a dialogue about men, and something that's not talked about, something that there's a taboo about with men, about having needs, of being sensitive, of being afraid. Even talking about low testosterone levels. This is all stuff that men really don't want anyone talking about. And in this conversation, we're bringing these things to light. And a lot of times when people are shown what has been hidden, when people see that their secret fears, their secret suffering is out there, that's terrifying. That's a very vulnerable feeling. And I can see how your project could trigger that in men, to see this, put on a website, on a video. Because, the things that you and I are talking about right now, men don't even talk about with each other.
Right.
So this is actually a very sensitive conversation. I think it's potentially emotionally charged for men and women, and I think that's also why it's been underground for so long. We all play a part in keeping it on the down low.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I think that's part of possibly what you experienced with that comment. Susie, is just what are you talking about? And that's not how it is. And I think maybe you actually touched on something really close to home.
Yeah, it's funny. What's nice is that we can all be part of this conversation. I think that's what the internet and what podcasts like yours do, is that they're able to pull all the voices into the conversation. And there are really wonderful men doing work. I think there's like the Wild Man organization, university, and even Robert Bly, is still out there writing and speaking. And so I feel like there is a growing men's movement right now. And they're still going out into the woods and they're teaching men how to talk to each other. And it's true that if we can all be in it together, then that's the best thing.
Susie, thank you so much for your time today and for sharing your insights and wisdom. I know that this conversation will be something that resonates with our listeners, and I'm sure we'll get a lot of reactions from it, but I think it's a topic that needs to be talked about.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's really great to talk to you.
Susie, what's the best way for listeners to get in touch with you and find out more about you?
They can go to my website, which is lightfieldmedia.us, which talks about the Testosterone Project and also the other work that I'm doing. And they'll find contact information there. Or they can also go to thegoodmenproject.com and they can find the Testosterone Project there, or as well as lots of other amazing articles about this topic. So
thank you so much again. And I'm looking forward to sharing our conversation with the world.
Thank you so much.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
I hope you enjoyed today's conversation with Susie. One of the things that stood out for me is the relationship between testosterone and earning power, and testosterone and assertiveness, and also the connection of low levels of testosterone to mood and depression. One of the takeaways for me from this conversation is that it is important to look at the biochemical aspects as part of a holistic view of understanding men and their struggles and supporting them in their healing process. It's important to acknowledge that men, as much as women, are struggling with the internal and external pressures that life presents, and that men, as much as women, are subject to societal and cultural expectations. This is not about dismissing or minimizing the struggles of women or getting into a contest of who has it worse or whose struggle is bigger. It's to acknowledge that everyone struggles. This is part of the human experience, and we all can benefit from compassion, support, and permission to be uniquely ourselves wherever we are on life's journey. For show notes to today's episode and for links to the resources mentioned, please visit www.lourdesfiato.com/women-in-depth. Again, thank you so much for listening, and see you next time. And if you're interested in learning more about how you get stuck in life, where you're stuck, and the reasons for this stuckness, then I invite you to go to my website and sign up for the Hello Fear exercise. This is a simple exercise that I put together designed to help you begin to get to know the fear in your life, begin to shift your relationship with fear, and to begin to experience fear differently. Again, thank you so much for listening, and see you next time.